Next, I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Bismarck Lepe. If you don't know Bismarck, a very interesting background. He founded the group Wizeline, which is still operating today, in 2014 with a mission to help companies build better products faster by making innovation accessible to all organizations. Bismarck is Mexican-American and the son of 2 immigrants from a small town in Jalisco. He left a successful path as an early employee at Google to start his own online video platform, Ooyala, which sold for $400 million to Telstra, the Australian telco, in 2014. For more than a decade, Bismarck has pioneered Mexican Silicon Valley cross-border collaboration with Ooyala and now Wizeline. Bismarck is passionate about driving economic growth in the global communities where Wizeline operates. In 2015, Bismarck launched Startup GDL, a nonprofit organization committed to making Guadalajara a leader in innovation. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Bismarck as our keynote speaker.
Today, especially the youth, they try to separate this idea of work-life, and I hate that idea. I believe that there should be true integration, and especially if you're a vendor, it's so easy for buyers to basically put up a wall if they just see you as a vendor. And so I think creating strong relationships that cut across decades, cut across industries, actually make you much, much stronger. So hopefully everybody here doesn't just trade business cards, but you start to build some of these lifelong relationships. So I'll start with a couple of anchor points. The first anchor point is Bill Gates talks about how everybody overestimates what you can achieve in 1 year, but underestimates what can be achieved in a decade. And I think as we go through the story, you'll see that that comes through over and over again. Second is an interesting story. Now there are a lot more successful Latino-based startups. Like we've seen Rappi, we've seen Nubank, we now see Latinos in US in key executive roles. That wasn't the case about 20 years ago. I remember being at an offsite with other of my peers at Google, and we were just talking, giving personal details, and someone says like, wow, you're Mexican. I didn't think you were Mexican. I thought you were, I don't know, Persian or Filipino or Indian. And then another one of my coworkers, this was a different time, said, no, it's all about context. You put a cook's hat and put him behind a serving aisle and he'll look Mexican. It's okay to laugh, it's fine. And then a couple of years later, this was post-financial crisis, 2009. This was my company, Ooyala, the video platform company. We knew it was going to become incredibly hard to hire and retain talent in the Silicon Valley. And so we decided to open an office in Guadalajara, Mexico. We looked all over the world, and we found Guadalajara, Mexico could be really interesting for us. And we go to the board, and we tell them we're going to open an office in Guadalajara. The board's excited, mostly white and Indian on our board. Like, that's great. We're already in London, but we need something in mainland because there's already this talk of the UK exiting Europe. And so Guadalajara, Spain sounds amazing. I'm like, no, Guadalajara, Mexico. And the response was, are there engineers in Mexico? And I responded with, yes, and electricity and internet, and the donkeys only come out on Thursdays. So I think context and bias is something that we all have to deal with. Maybe context helps us fight some of the bias. So as Kirk was mentioning, my family's from a little town just outside of Guadalajara, Mexico. For those who aren't familiar with Mexico, central Mexico, this little town, when my wife was pregnant with our firstborn, I took her down to this town, and she still recounts the fact that there were more donkeys than cars. And so my mom's side of the family was solidly upper middle class in a country that didn't really have a middle class, but they were solidly upper middle class. My dad was dirt poor, literally lived in a house with dirt floors and adobe walls. And he had 7 siblings. And his dad was part of the Bracero program, which was this program that was around in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, where they brought Mexican immigrants to work in the fields in the US on a work permit. And when my dad was 13, he received a telegram saying, I got you a work permit. I'm going to come back and pick you up, and we're going to move back to the US, and you're going to work in the fields with me. The following week, he received a telegram, not that his dad had arrived, but that his dad had died in a car crash. And so, eventually the body made it all the way back down to their little town in Mexico. And at the funeral, apparently my grandmother was so distraught because she didn't know what would become of the family and her 8 kids. And so at that point, my dad said, he just said, I have to take the reins of this family. And so he contacted his uncle, sent a telegram, contacted his uncle, the youngest brother, my grandfather, and said, hey, I have this work permit. I'm coming. I'm going to work. Like, this is the only way I can support the family. And my dad's uncle said, no, just stay, be a bagger, work for the post office in this little town. And my dad's like, there's no way I can do that. So he told his mom, like, I'm going. And he took a bus to Tijuana, and then his uncle met him there. And that started about a 25-year career of working in the fields. He then eventually married my mom. My mom did have a college degree, but when she joined him in the US, because she didn't speak English, they worked in the fields. Eventually, I came along, and for the first 7 years of my life, I followed them. So we would leave the little village in April and move to Southern California, and we would plant and pick strawberries. My dad would pick lemons. Then eventually, by like June, July, we would move to the Central Valley of California, pick peaches, nectarines, and walnuts. And then eventually, we would move up to Washington State, pick apples, and by December, we would be back down in their little village. We did this until I was 7, and then my parents said, you know what, we think education is important. Moving around is probably not a good idea. So we settled down in Southern California, and my parents were maniacal about education. When I was in 2nd grade, I think they made about $13,000 combined. They bought me a $3,000 computer. And in 3rd grade, they hired an instructor to teach me how to program, teach me about hardware. And my parents sat me down and said, look, we don't understand how this academic educational system works in the US, but you have to go to college. It's like, we'll work 3, 4, 5 jobs, whatever is required for you to be able to go to a good academic institution. I'm like, all right. So I was lucky enough to get into Stanford. I say lucky because there were a lot of other people who were probably way more qualified that didn't get in. I believe I benefited from affirmative action. So I am in support of affirmative action. It's not a perfect program, but I believe it helped me get into Stanford. And going back to the story about how I started programming when I was in 3rd grade, by the time I was in 6th grade, I was a pretty good programmer. But I thought technology was advancing so quickly. I'm like, by the time I'm 18, 19, algorithms are going to be writing algorithms. Like, I need to do something else. Technically, I think I will be right. I think the timeline was wrong at the time. So I like backed away from technology. And when I got into Stanford, I'm like, I'm going to study human biology, basically do pre-med, and eventually become a doctor. I get to Stanford in 98. 98, everybody remembers. The summer of 98, broadcast.com went public. Mark Cuban's company. 99, it was acquired for $6 billion by Yahoo. And I get to Stanford, and I see a bunch of these 22-year-olds driving Porsche Turbos, NXSs, Ferraris. And the first thing that comes to mind is, like, they're obviously not doctors. They're too young. Being Mexican, the second thing that comes to mind is, are they in the drug trade? They were not in the drug trade. They were engineers working at pre-IPO companies with pre-IPO shares that they could go to course and apparently get credit or be able to lease a car. I don't know. So immediately I changed my focus and I studied economics and computer science, full degree in economics. But really what I did was I worked at technology companies. So for 4 years, I would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, go into whatever startup I was working at until 9 a.m., then go back to class from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., and then back to the office from 2 p.m. until 8 p.m. or whenever they would serve dinner, and then I would leave after they would serve dinner and go to school and study for a couple of hours. And I would do this Sunday through Thursday night, and then Saturday and Sunday I would work 15, 16 hours. I loved it. The practical side of it, I was able to pay for college, which at the time was probably $60,000 a year. But I learned a tremendous amount. And the exposure it gave me. So the final company I worked at when I was a senior in college was this company called Elance, which many of you probably remember. It merged, now it's called Upwork. And eventually I realized that I wasn't going to be a good enough engineer to just be an engineer. So I started working on the business side of things, and I was running marketing programs. And we were working with this company called Overture, which was then acquired by Yahoo. And so one day, Elance had a board meeting, and this guy that I didn't know, I later found out, name was John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins, came to me and he's like, hey, we just invested in this little search engine. They're about 13 people, and they're about to launch their advertising platform. Can we send some of the Overture money their way? And it's like, oh, what company? Oh, Google. I'm like, oh, Google, yeah, when I was at Stanford, I still use Backrub. And I'm like, all right. So I ended up becoming Google's first customer. I was Google's biggest customer, and Google was growing so quickly that eventually I became a customer that they wouldn't even return their phone calls because there were other more important customers. And then when I was about to graduate from college, the head of sales approached me and said, hey, you know the platform, the advertising platform better than our product managers and engineers. Just come work at Google. And being a very loyal person, I said, Elance has allowed me to pay for school. They've been very flexible with when and how I work, and they've already given me a full-time offer for when I graduate. And the guy looked at me and was like, we're doing $650,000 of revenue a day with 96 employees. I'm like, you're right, I should go to Google. And it was a phenomenal ride. When I finally joined, several months later, I was employed about 220. And in the 4.5 years that I was there, the company grew from 220 to over 10,000 and about $500 million in revenue to over $16 billion in revenue. And I was just talking to someone, and we were talking about how at startups, you build process and structure, and then eventually as you grow out of it. And I was telling him, like, we were doing this every week or every other week because the company was growing so quickly. We were actually repricing our options every 2 weeks because we knew that the SEC would have an issue with the price of the options once we actually went public. So the board was meeting every 2 weeks to reprice the options. Incredible experience. In 2009, when we looked all over the world and we set up our operations in Guadalajara, it reconnected me with my roots. And for me, I think it gave me a higher purpose. Growing up poor, for me, the lifelong goal up to that point was I need to make money. And the fact that I was going to go into medicine wasn't to help lives. Helping lives was good, but I needed to make money. I joined Google pre-IPO. Google goes public in 2004, and that I made some money. And then that just kind of disappeared, and it was no longer like my driving force. And while I was very interested in starting my own company, I was a little aimless for a while. And so we decided to invest in Guadalajara. And initially, I too was skeptical on whether or not we should invest in Guadalajara. I mean, my parents left Mexico. And I grew up thinking of Mexico a little bit like a former president used to speak about Mexico. It's corrupt, it's dangerous, there's zero upward mobility. And so when this consultant came to us and said, Mexico's really interesting, I questioned it. And so we went to Guadalajara and we interviewed 15 engineers. And of the 15 engineers, 8 were as good, if not better, than the engineers that we had worked with at Google. So we're like, oh, there's something interesting here. But what was most interesting was the quantity and the quality of the talent and the entrepreneurial spirit that we also found there. And that's why we started Startup GDL. That's why we've been very supportive of bringing more technology companies into the region. Latin America is very interesting right now. If you look at the US population, it's 22% Hispanic. Of that, about half have Mexican heritage of some kind. And so obviously, like as we think about what being Hispanic look like in the US, it's going to look a lot, it's going to be very heavily influenced by Mexico. There are going to be pockets like Florida, it's be a little bit more Cuban. In New York, in this part, it's probably going to be a little more Puerto Rican, Dominican Republic, but generally, there are a lot of Mexicans, and so I think that general influence is going to be that. And I think we're going to see 22% go to 35% because Hispanics aren't just going to marry Hispanics. And so overnight, you're going to see that number, that percentage grow. And then the final thing I'll say is, and I'll speak a little bit about AI. I gave a talk about AI last week. And I think sometimes people talk about AI and the hype cycle, and it's like, oh, there's so much hype. And but unlike crypto, like AI is something that's been around for decades, right? Like if we think about what AI is, machine learning, like having machines really think for you and accelerate what you can do, right? Turing became famous because he was able to crack the German code with a machine that could automate calculations significantly faster than a human. And so we are at the point where we are commercializing a lot of research that has been going into AI for decades. And the really big tech companies have been using machine learning, have had neural networks and the ability to use neural networks to optimize their businesses for decades in some cases. And now these tools and services are being made available to companies. Some of the ways that we're using AI at the company is to make onboarding and our engineers a lot more efficient. Like we've created like the little engineering angel that shows and steers our people in the right direction to make sure that they're developing code the way that we want them to develop code at our company. Designers, same thing. And this is beyond just a regular co-pilot. This is something that has been trained to teach people the Wizeline way. And so I would recommend that in a world where if suddenly we become 10 times more efficient, which we're on our way, depending on whom you believe, general intelligence is 6 to 36 months away, and super intelligence is anywhere between 36 and 48 months away. We need to make sure that we adopt these technologies or we are going to be left behind.